with us. She's AUC's Distinguished University Scholar. And we are also very pleased that she has agreed to give this talk for the GAP School, Global Affairs and Public Policy. For those of you who don't know her, and I'm sure everyone does, but just in case, Leila Fawaz is the Issam M. Faris Professor of Lebanese and Eastern Mediterranean Studies and was the founding director of the Faris Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Tufts University. Dr. Fawaz was named a Chevalier in the French National Order of the Legion of Honor in 2012. She has a very extensive bio, so I'll just, maybe pick some of the highlights for you. She's also, oh, she's also many things. She has served as president of the Harvard Board of Overseers and on committees for the American Historical Association, Carnegie, and the Comité Scientifique de la Maison Méditerranéenne de Sciences de l'Homme. I hope that wasn't too bad, Dr. Fawaz. I try. Anyway, she also has published many books, also with the AUC Press, and she continues to research the experiences of individuals during and after the World War I in the Middle East. We also have from AUC Dr. Mo'nis Hojari, and he's assistant professor at the Department of History, and he'll be moderating this panel. Thank you.
Hello.
The first thing I have to say is that I'm glad that I wasn't the one who had to basically choose a small piece to present Professor Fawaz, because honestly, I work in Lebanese circles and I'm a historian, focuses on Lebanon. So I would never think that I would ever need to introduce Leila Fawaz. I usually just say, Leila Fawaz, and I move on. And then if I needed to really, pick or at least do any justice, we'll probably be here till fall. So I'm glad that you did it. But again, if you were in my class on Lebanon, normally by week 2, you should know who we're talking about, or you're not showing up. So it's an honor to have you here with us. So thank you so much. And please, join me all in welcoming Professor Fawaz here.
Thank you, Moen. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I have really been very excited about this visit. And it meant a lot to me because as a child also, we used to come Khartoum, and we used to come from Khartoum via Egypt to go to Lebanon, and then came back as a scholar to work in the archives here in an earlier book. And it's just really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. Thank you so much. My talk will be probably half an hour, which is what we had agreed on, and then talk afterwards. The title of the talk is The First World War in the Shaping of the Middle East, What Role It Had. Ever since the centennial of World War I, much ink has been spilled over the high politics of the Great War of 1914-1918. By now, the events of World War I and the names associated with the settlement of Versailles are familiar to most students of history, and surely to Woodrow Wilson, to George Clemenceau, to Lloyd George, and to others. Very little about them from me. You see, as you know, I'm a Lebanese academic who has long made her home in America. as civil war engulfed my country last century, I watched in horror from afar as a people I loved descended into conflict in Lebanon. I was appalled by the recriminations and watched with disgust as cynical leaders in Lebanon stoked the embers of disagreement time and again and continue to do that. Ever since, I have devoted myself to telling the story of the peoples of the region rather than that of manipulative outsiders or its leaders. Hear from me about a different great war, the war as experienced from civil society, from peasants and laborers to prisoners and profiteers. This is the story of how people in the Middle East experienced the Great War and how it shaped the psychology of the region for the decades that followed, including today. In America, where we live, as we get closer to national elections, we become bombarded with local and national news about the future of these elections. We learn more and more about the defects of the candidates, all candidates running for election. But what is surprising is that television analysts and other experts almost never mention the First World War or blame it for the unease facing much of the Middle East today. What a contrast with commentators and politicians of the Middle East, what a contrast with European newspapers, journals, debates familiar with the Middle East, and others in conversations involving the Middle East as, as a secret war agreement. I could not get my students interested in some years ago to something called that you know the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, essentially between the British and the French, and that repeatedly was the source of much of the breakup of the modern Middle East, the creation of artificial borders that benefited Western colonial powers. Even ISIS, the famous ISIS, has helped bring world attention to that Sykes-Picot Agreement when a few years ago in June of 2014, it tweeted that they were smashing the agreement in reference to a video that showed the group bulldozing a bench on the Iraqi-Syrian border. Some of you may have seen that. Why are old agreements from a century ago now, why are they at the center of heated debates in the Middle East? Because the suffering endured in the Great War of the Middle East was central to the misery of the 20th century, and because decisions taken then have affected relations among peoples of the Middle East, but also among the Middle East and colonial powers that ruled the Middle East after the end of the war. Sometime between the 1920s and the 1970s, the countries of the Middle East acquired independence, but independence with problems tied to the First World War, essential to understanding where we are today. So it's a connection with the present that is so important. Focusing on history is a must to make sense of the present. Memories live with us in the present. They are transmitted from one generation to another and affect the present, not only the past. Refugees who move from their places of origin to distant lands might have an opportunity to get over the past, although they rarely do. But what about refugees who do not move too far away from their countries of origin? They settle close by to where they came from, remember their suffering, and pass it on to future generations who keep the past alive, pass it on to those not yet born, aware of that, pass it on in textbooks, novels, the theater, music, and keep up all sorts of remembrances that are handed down and perpetuate the horrors of war. The links between the past and the present affect our identities. The Great War, as it is called also, transformed the Middle East, bringing to an end hundreds of years of Ottoman rule in the Arab lands, while giving rise to the Middle East as we know it today. After this war, extensive areas of former Ottoman Syrian provinces, also known as Greater Syria, were carved out into mandates and protectorates, territories to be ruled by colonial empires, the British and the French in our part of the world. Those against colonial foreign rule would have many more battles to fight before they could be free from European direct domination. During all those decades, in addition to redrawing the political map of the Middle East, World War I altered the everyday lives of the peoples of the region and began a long process of reshaping their identities. In the US, the issue of identity in the Middle East is regularly presented as one of religious hatreds that date back to time immemorial. In reality, there is not one individual reason for how we got where we are. There are several. There is the drawing of borders for a future Middle East, which is now getting media attention. Important also were the numerous strategies over our long 20th century to prolong old divisions and create new ones to divide and rule the region, as different states have used different plans of action to impose their vision and will on their populations, and in as much as they can to impose their will and vision over their neighbors. We also know that the eruption of violence can be tied to socioeconomic issues. We have seen people of different sects help one another in times of crisis, and people of the same sect take different positions in conflict based on economic need and differences. There are also the more nuanced and long-term collective effects of war on society. Cynicism was one outcome of the Great War. The promises by the Allies to respect and support national aspirations took second place to realpolitik, and the peoples of the Middle East learned the hard way not to trust any ruler's promises. Cynicism in small doses can be useful in politics, but the massive disappointment felt after the outcome of World War I led to a depth of distrust in government that did not bode well for the rest of the century. Also, experience with war left its mark on the population. On the eve of World War I, people in Europe had gotten used to peace, according to the renowned professor Margaret Macmillan. In contrast, on the eve of World War I, people in the Middle East had already been exhausted by wars, including civil wars, by conscription, by years of and even decades of service in the army away from home, often not making it possible to ever return home, and by their families surviving by their wits and with few sources of income. In fact, before even the First World War began, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had so exhausted those who were conscripted that when the First World War started, many did not realize the break between, on the one hand, the Balkan Wars, and on the other hand, the First World War, and saw it all as one continuum of conflict and forced conscription. Then, when the First World War began, most did not see it or write about it as a war with a worthy or noble cause. To them, there was no great war. That's a very important point. To them, there were many small, separate wars. As the great historians, I'm going to mention two, Chris Bailey, the preeminent historian of India and the British Empire, and the pioneer of the fields of global history, and the other historian, Hugh Strachan, renowned for his works on the British Army and the history of the First World War. As they both put it, many lived the war as a series of small wars. It is only decades after that the memory of war evolved and began to be described as a great war of suffering, what was called Safar Barlik, or mobilization, and the great ordeal of barefoot soldiers crossing cities, deserts, whole regions away from home, as well as the great ordeal of starving civilians facing famine, locust, disease, uprooting, dislocation, and levels of misery so profound and so lasting that its memory was passed on from one generation to the next. In the West, the war hardened and solidified already formed national identities. But in the East, the war shattered the imperial Ottoman system that for all its faults and for much of the time allowed a multiplicity of identities to coexist. The losses were staggering, as the war did not only destroy armies, it also destroyed societies and economies. In this way, the experience of World War I in the Middle East is perhaps more akin to the experience of World War II in Europe. Think about it when you read again about Europe and the Middle East. It destroyed societies and economies, and the experience was more akin to the experience of World War II in Europe than it was to the others. The social, economic, and psychological effects were deep and devastating. It ravaged the land. The experience of the war was immensely damaging, not only on conscripts and other soldiers, but also on civilians. It has been estimated that the countries of the Middle East suffered more proportionately than any other belligerent, including Europe. In Greater Syria, estimates put casualties conservatively at around 500,000 people. This is not to diminish the social disruption and suffering experienced in the West. They were immense. It is imprudent to evaluate the balance of human misery in equivalent measures. The point, rather, is that the experience and memory of the war were altogether different. Many of those who actually fought the war did not remain in the Middle East. Many of the Indians who fought in Kut in Mesopotamia returned to India. Many of the British forces under Allenby that drove across the Sinai and up to Palestine and Damascus, with the Arab irregulars on their flank, overtaking them and keeping the Ottoman army off balance and on the defensive, they went back to Britain and its colonies. Many of the Germans who supported and advised their Ottoman allies when they returned to Germany, all of this was happening. But the local population, returning recruits and civilians of that population who survived the war, stayed closer to home. And in staying closer to home, they were the main keepers of memories. Yet, learning about the past or remembering it properly is difficult at all times. On one level, there is a private nature to memory. We cannot remember what we did not experience. So in looking at how memories of the war shaped the identity of Greater Syria, it is important to understand private, personal characteristics, but also that it had its public, more broad-based nature. The civilian experience of the war varied across a wide range, from those who lost everything to the war profiteers who made fortunes, from Ottoman pashas trying to stay in control, to locals who became known as martyrs, hanged in 1915 and 1916 in Beirut, Damascus, and Palestine because they were accused of collaborating against their Ottoman rulers on the side of the Entente enemy. The civilian experience of the Great War also included the men who died, the refugees who did not survive long marches deprived of the most basic needs, the women and children who were exploited, and those who found opportunities for some autonomy in villages that previously were controlled by husbands, brothers, fathers. In one way or another, a vast majority of the population simply endured. Among them were also those who worked hard to start businesses, but then had to move their families around after the outbreak of war and even the conclusion of war. Refugees are a huge part of the story. The flow of populations and migrations that globalized the Middle East. On another level, there is a broader, more public nature to memory in how memory is used to reshape and rewrite the past. At the group, at the official, at the national or collective level. It is something nations and their national figures try to do. Those who were in power at the time of great conflicts and survived them rewrite the history of the war to drive their particular points home, to justify the failure of some leaders to rise above parties, or the failure of others to put their interests below those of their nations and their peoples, or to give themselves glorified roles at stressful times for their people. In this context, it is sometimes very hard to see heroes among our leaders in the Middle East. I searched for heroes while writing a book on World War I, but ended up admiring the common people and not their political leaders. Ordinary men and women often survived war with dignity and courage. It was harder to find leaders who were fighting for broader causes or ideologies rather than for their own interests. With time, say by the mid-20th century, some of these leaders or politicians wrote memoirs in which they gave themselves important roles in the Great War. Some political figures were justified to make a case for their own heroism in past decades. Less studied, and for some of us more deserving, were the ordinary folks who survived war and had no reason to embellish how they lived or how they remembered it. There is a simplicity in their depiction of the war and its remembrance. So what do we make of the gap between what people tell us happened and what probably did happen? It's an important question because it is important to get clarity about what happened in the past, the violent past, and make it possible for younger generations to expect accountability and to get it. The absence of accountability is dramatic and essential in shaping the future. Learning about the past, remembering it properly is difficult at all times, but not explaining it clearly then confuses the present. Do we trust contrary visions and interpretations of, say, one figure of the Great War and accept that remembrance can be contradictory, uncertain, fragile, but also real? Perhaps some of the complexity of the relationship between memory and war is that the gaps between what people tell us happened and what probably happened are simply the results of different interpretations of the same public figure and event. To us who study the Great War, it was the worst of times, a time of suffering and deprivation. But listen to what, for example, Anis Fraiha, a notable Lebanese author who had written extensively about Lebanese traditional villages, say about this time. He experienced the Great War as a secure youth, sheltered and surrounded by family and village traditions that infused his formative years with stability and joy. He writes that, as for us, the youngsters, we did not care much about the war and the news. We were happy during that summer of 1914 because we were back to our playgrounds. We left the news of the war to the adults. As war went by, he of course realized the suffering caused by the depth of the famine, the locusts which ravaged whole areas, the loss of relatives who had gone to war and never came back, and the other disasters that war caused. But the fact that he had so many happy memories in the midst of disaster is real. Read or talk to people who lived the wars of the Middle East then and in more recent times, and they will dwell on some extraordinarily happy personal experience and memories in the midst of tragedy. Kamal Salibi, the most eminent Lebanese historian of our century, lived the horrors of the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990, the Civil War of 1975 to 1990, current times. And yet he used to talk about happy memories during that same time. He would talk about a walk on empty streets in peace at night without bombing. He would talk about being unhurt in the middle of tense checkpoints. In the midst of shelling or in kidnapping, there were a lot of those. He also, however, talked about the warmth of numerous family gatherings and personal friendships at times of great loss. All a mix of terrible fear and fragility with intensely memorable and appreciated souvenirs of times with those he cared for. The private versus the public, the familiar versus the distance, the experienced versus the untested. It all was lived at the same time or in succession. And it once tainted and enhanced the recalling of the past decades after its happening, and it did it at the same time. The passage of time altered recollections. In the decades that followed the Great War, the older village people spoke warmly of the Ottomans and did not recall them as having been particularly foreign or oppressive. What became foreign to those villagers was the French mandate that replaced the Ottomans after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war. Among women in one village, the year of the French takeover from the Ottomans, 1918-1919, was remembered as Sint al-Ihtilal, or the year of foreign French occupation. The passage of time also shaped the future. Allies in war became antagonistic rulers and ruled after the war. So people who were allies became enemies after the war. This is a very important point. Those who helped the Allies win the war became their subjects under their direct colonial rule, civilian or military or both, from ally and partner in war to being a subject after the war. The Egyptians, of course, had the British before and they continued to be in charge for a long time after. The same in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, and what was then Transjordan, then Jordan, what then became Israel. In all these areas, there were people who were coming in supposedly to help and who supposedly used the help of the local people. And then after the war, became their masters. The presence of new masters, imperial masters, colonial members, citizens, French and British soldiers, administrators, educators, professionals, and what else went through the Middle East during and after the war. Englishmen, Welshmen, Scots and Irish, but also Australians, New Zealanders, Indian, West Indians, and many others in contact with the populations of the Arab populations and the Arab provinces in the late Ottoman Empire, and in making contact with the local populations. They developed perspectives and prejudices about one another. The war played itself out in the Middle East and Africa, and not only on the Western Front in Europe. It proved pivotal to incorporating these regions into global networks of imperialism. And in doing so, the First World War did not just lay down new imperial structures, but it also helped crystallize existing prejudices and foster new stereotypes formed in times of conflict. On the one hand, soldiers drawn from different empires gained a first-hand experience that formed the basis of a mixture in their attitudes of condescension, disdain, but also respect towards the peoples of the region. On the other hand, local populations began to perceive imperial aims in a more negative light as they became caught in the territorial schemes of the colonial powers, and as the horrors of new foreign occupations engulfed their homelands, tarnishing the luster of Western modernity that we have heard so much about in the, say, from 1750 to the present, studying Western Europe and the Middle East. Thus, the First World War was not just a moment of rupture, signaling a break from the globalized world of the years before 1914, but also a moment in which new networks of global integration were formed. Did such contacts and encounters have lasting effects on the perspectives of outsiders to the Middle East and the local population towards each other? In particular, did the relationship that developed between military officers and soldiers with each other, but also with the local populations during the war, affect the relationships that emerged in the subsequent transitional period from war to mandate, continued protectorate, to questionable degrees of self-governance and independence? A mess. It is reasonable to assume so when one compares the eagerness to copy and to learn from the West in earlier times to the later continuing wariness, suspicion about the intentions of the West when it became an open, with armies, colonial power. In that sense, the First World War, far from putting an abrupt end to the first age of globalization, heralded the elaboration of new networks, bringing unprecedented numbers of military and technical personnel to the Middle East. But in doing so, it served to entrap the region in new global structures of imperial governance and to lay down the foundations for enduring mutual suspicions then and now. How relations have become more critical and more tense, I will indicate by simply ending this talk with a quote from the Lebanese American poet Khalil Gibran, who was born in the late 19th century in a village in the north of Lebanon and lived much of his life in the US. Contrasting the suffering of our lands in the Middle East with the ease in America, where he lived so much of his life, when he contrasted the suffering on one and the ease of the other, he wrote, "My people," meaning those in the Middle East, "my people died from hunger, and he who did not perish from starvation was butchered with the sword. And I," meaning him in America, "and I am here in this distant land, roaming amongst a joyful people who sleep upon soft beds and smile at the days while the days smile upon them." End of quote. For today's younger generation, to which many of you belong, there may be a way out from the violence and suffering I have focused this talk on. I also talked about distrust, its importance, and that it is irreversible. Perhaps not. Perhaps it is not irreversible, the distrust, because soft power, as opposed to violent power, is still an option. It has proven its effectiveness. It has proven its effectiveness before. It can do so again. But I feel that perhaps it will not be in my lifetime. I'm too old for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fawaz. I'm gonna actually present to you my own reflections, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So, as someone who, well, to put it bluntly, I started my career at AUC 10 years ago. So in that time, it's been centennial after centennial. So the beginning of the war, then there's of course Anzac Day and the Battle of Gallipoli, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration. So again, as a part of my teaching and research, it's been about World War I. And as I actually developed my own courses, and I'm someone who doesn't write about World War I, so I'm thankful for what I can read. Again, from your latest book, A Land of Aching Hearts. I mean, I can't think of a better way of describing the Middle East in World War I. But there are certain things that I would notice as a reader and also as someone who's teaching the topic to, in some cases, an audience that does not have a background in history or even the Middle East. And I would immediately make a comparison with World War II. So in popular culture, in Eurocentric culture, the Second World War is really present everywhere. It's not unusual to expect even young generations to be familiar with certain things from the Second World War, while the First World War is kind of like, you know, the soft opening, something that happened in, you know, in the midst of time. And the Europe of today is a post-World War II order. So the first thing I actually try to communicate to my students is that that's not the case for the Middle East. This is a post-World War I Middle East. So, and in fact, today you just heard about something very important, something that compared the place and the experience between the Middle East and Europe in World War I and World War II. Soldiers die in war, that's a fact. But the casualties in the Middle East were actually mostly civilian in World War I. The exact opposite was for at least Central and Western Europe. So in terms of who experienced the war and how they experienced it, of course, World War II in total as a calamity is something unprecedented. But for the Middle East specifically, while there is a trauma with the Middle East experienced the Second World War, but the real trauma, the disruption, the main calamities, and the way the civilians experienced the war, the First World War was actually very different from the second one. So when we talk about famine, when we talk about mass massacres, when we talk about a genocide, again, this is the First World War. While again in France, World War I was tragic, much of it was fought on French lands, but the casualties were primarily soldiers. For the Germans, it was mainly soldiers. Same for the British. The Americans seem to get lucky every time. Location matters, I suppose. So the point here in terms of like who experienced it and who actually can tell us more about it, in terms of the First World War, it's actually, you know, what I have described as the everyday person, the average person, because the war came to you. And then when I actually present a map to describe the Middle East, I always kind of like, I'm careful warning my students about maps and how inaccurate or misleading they can be. But again, they're not very different from, I always make the joke, I'm not sure what he was using, what Mark Sykes was using when he was, you know, with his pencil and ruler and, you know, deciding on what the Transjordan would eventually be like. So the emergence of this Middle East, and again, when I teach, let's say, you know, the making of the modern Arab world, I'm careful to distinguish that the historical experience in the Maghreb might be different. So for Egypt and the Mashriq, the eastern part of the Arab world, really World War I drew the map, literally. This is not kind of like, so not an exaggeration. Even in places where the war did not actually touch the civilian population in terms of hostilities, the war broke the back of the civilian population in Egypt, almost directly leading to the 1919 revolution. So even Egyptian nationalism and Egyptian identity was kind of being crystallized in those years. When I'm teaching about nationalism and I want to make a clean, safe break, as in safe, like, again, I can easily argue for it, between Arabism and then Arab nationalism, I decide on, well, World War I is a nice cutoff place. The Ottoman Empire ceases to exist. If I'm talking about an intellectual or a politician and I say, when can we talk about this person as an Ottomanist? And then clearly they show up as a Turkish nationalist. Again, the safest point is the fall of the empire. So the outcome of World War I. The fate of Palestine, you know, again, we're now, this is Nakba date. Well, yesterday it was. So the point is here, the Nakba took place in 48, but the Balfour Declaration, which sealed the fate of Palestine, was 1917. And it was the British mandate for Palestine in the 20s. That's kind of what eventually sealed the fate of Palestine. So the impact of the, you know, the First World War on the region, again, it's difficult to explain sometimes, especially for people who don't have a background in that. But the easiest thing to say is look around you at the Middle East you see today. This primarily happened because of the First World War, not the Second World War. So this is actually something, the scale was very different in the Middle East. The people who experienced it, again, between civilian and between officials and soldiers and so on, and the outcome. So a turning point in the history of Germany would be, of course, defeat in World War II. You might say, of course, the end of the Cold War. But in terms of something, let's say, called Lebanon, and the reason it exists and why it exists, and even how it exists, that's a World War I issue. Even sectarianism in Lebanon and Syria, again, how it's codified. It's, again, the experience during the French Mandate and what led to things. So even when we look at a region now that is a bit in chaos, that's actually what I decided on as a title for week 1 of the Making of the Modern Arab World in my class. The title was Sykes-Picot to ISIS, 100 years of continuity and change. That's actually, again, this was exactly the first time I taught it when ISIS had actually symbolically and physically destroyed the boundary between Syria and Iraq. So it's really 100 years in the making. What we're seeing now literally kind of was written and drawn mainly in the First World War. And that is why it's a turning point, a colossal turning point. But also, since I also work on nationalism, this is when really our identities were kind of being changed, transformed, generated, imagined, whatever term you want to use. So for why is Syria Syria, this Syria, which was never there, and Lebanon is Lebanon? Why do we have a Jordan and a Jordanian identity, right, in Iraq? These are all essentially things that happen in World War I and are experienced by people, and people reacting to the outcomes of that war. Essentially, a war that really came to almost every house in, let's call it the Arab East. And that's why essentially that's my sort of like impression on it. So when I'm teaching, I sometimes skip the Second World War on purpose or by accident. But in making the modern Middle East, you basically don't just not skip World War I, you linger there. You take your time there. Because if you don't understand what happened in those years, the disruption, the change, and the trauma, and the aftermath, then you can't really make sense of what it is that you see today. And again, we're thankful for someone like Professor Fawaz to actually have written a book about it and for your representation today. So I have much to thank you. And I would like actually everyone to join me again and thank you. Thank you so much for your.
Suppose it's on. He's wonderful, as I had heard, very lively, very to the point. But before we get into this, I left something to the end intentionally because the audience was much less than it is now, because I wanted to thank a few people for the honor of being here. I want to start with the Provost Abdul Rahman, who actually made me this invitation. I want to thank even more enthusiastically Noha Al-Mikawi, the Dean and Doctor, who truly took a big burden when she invited me. She did not know me. She did not know how difficult I am, I think. She did not know that I will be so needy because I had never been to this new magnificent AUC. And she was amazing in helping me. Somebody else would have given up and I would have given up coming. So I have a very special thank to her. I also want to thank people who helped her and helped me, who work for her, who work for the provost. I have to mention only a few because I can't mention everyone. Hind Al-Ziki, who some of you know, I'm sure. She is incredible. Thank you for noticing. Amazing. And also Ahad Hussein, who is here. Oh, I'm sorry, you tell her later. Okay, yeah. And I thought it was better to be at the end when everybody's here. And finally, I wanted to say that there are lots of people in those offices at AUC who have been incredibly helpful. People who were on emails like Shireen Mahfouz and Christine Wadi, but also a lot of people who are really very indispensable to what is happening. And I'm very grateful to them. There are people way far from here who are also helping me. There is a professor who used to be here who is now in our university, Dr. Khalid Fahmi, who has written on World War I and how the British treated the Egyptians in World War I and not the way they presented it. What they presented was not how they really treated the Egyptians, which is something they have done in many places. And in addition to all that, there is just an enormous amount of people here, including my youngest and newest colleague, Dr. Muannis Hojairi, for what they have done in bringing you interested in those topics and making you understand the importance of learning the past to learn the future. In America, they are happy with the present and the future, especially at times of elections now, like now. But you, all of you, have a responsibility to continue to remind the outside world about the importance of what is happening now and will happen again. Thank you very much.
Before I open the floor for questions, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have a mic. That doesn't happen often. So I'm going to start with my own first question to you, actually, since you looked at the archives and the memoirs, and then you mentioned that there is a kind of a rupture between the soldiers who experienced the war and between, in some cases, their own families or their own communities. And of course, you might have a soldier from southern Syria fighting for the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli, and his perspective of the war is very different from someone in, let's say, Suwaida or Mount Lebanon or Palestine about what was going on. Was there something striking that you found in terms of like glaring, in terms of the difference between Ottoman soldiers from the Ottoman provinces in Syria and the way they remember the war, and between their own communities and the way those communities remember the war.
Question, I think it's a good thesis topic for someone because there isn't enough on this. But I also, it leads me to mentioning that um, the difference between the Ottomans and those who were local and did not go to war and live is very important now because of some work the Indians have done. Indian scholars are extraordinary. And what they have done is good work on prisoners. I mentioned them only in the beginning and never came back to them because this talk was too short for that. But a lot of people went to prison when they were caught as soldiers of Ottoman lands. And then the the actually Turkish soldiers and the population got very angry at the Arabs because the Arabs were um, helping the enemy, the British and the French, especially the British, who had conquered India and taken it over and stayed there forever, and then came and conquered Egypt and conquered many other protectorates. And so there was feeling something that I don't remember hearing about, that before the period of the war, from outside the meaning South Asia, of opinion about what their experience was, and the resentment of some important Indian scholars and local people and people. They went to the same prison sometimes and they talked to one another, or they hated each other in prison. But what is so interesting is that among the Indians, they began to really dislike the Arab soldiers who had gone to prison and who seemed to have at the time helped the enemy. And after the war, there was a movement in India which was very rebellious to, and the tensions with the Arabs remained for a long time, correct? They were not so happy with the Arab Muslims, who like them were Muslims who had taken the side of the enemy. So there are lots of tensions, not only among what he is talking about, but also among the people who saw they should have all been on the same side, but they were not. It's only in very modern times that they seem more friendly now. And maybe it's not a blessing because I don't know how popular the new president is in Turkey, how long he will last. But there are tensions even now because of what happened in World War I. And very few people have studied it outside India. So what you made, the point you made is very important and should be better studied.
Thank you, and I'll open the floor for questions. Yes.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your presentations, to both of you. I'm Thomas Guterres from the Law Department. And as a non-historian, what I find most striking about history for the last 4 or 5 decades is the multiplicity of perspectives that have been legitimated, so to speak, in historical discourse, right? So from micro-history to histories of everyday life, from macro histories to the annal, to everything basically goes, right? You can pick your perspective and you can be, as Laduri would say, a truffle hunter or a parachutist, and choose your perspective accordingly. And also the whole question of what is the turning point or the watershed moment has also been, as of late, a very important concern for historians. When did human rights emerge? Was it in the 70s? Was it in the 40s? Was it in the, etc.? Now, all this multiplicity of perspectives, which has enriched history tremendously, has also led to memories of war, like the ones you described, becoming wars of memory. In other words, we're battling as to whose mnemonic framework is going to prevail over the next person's. And within that context, I wanted to ask you, as a historian, what do you see your role to be in this multiplicity of perspectives? Is it to write back into history those perspectives that have been neglected by the salaried historians and the mainstreams of the past in order to empower? Or as a non-historian, I'm very curious to see how would you as a historian situate yourself within this multiplicity? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, again, very interesting question. The multiplicity of perspectives has not diminished at all, as you know, because partly the centennial of the First World War has gotten a lot of attention in some circles. Since I live in Boston, I know that the Kennedy School at Harvard did a lot of things, some of them about Versailles and the effect of the Versailles Treaty after the war. But then COVID came, COVID, and it stopped all the conferences, everything stopped. So we never completely really, it was never examined properly. But at the same time, there was a feeling that memories of war are still with us. And what makes it clear is actually the superb work of mostly European historians, not local Arab historians or Turkish historians or Iranian historians, as far as I know, etc. It was really the work of historians from there. And it a lot of time even thinking about World War I, not only World War II. What I found particularly interesting with the one scholar I mentioned who now lives in Canada, and she was related to Lloyd George, I think, that this was a time when there was a lot to be gained by studying the First World War, but people got involved in the Second World War and the terrible situation, and people let the First World War go down, except for certain minorities. The Armenians are a very interesting point. Magnificent work is being done on the Armenians, and more can be done. Other than, somebody help me here.
I might add something from another perspective, actually, since you brought it up. On the one hand, there are so many settled issues about World War I in the Middle East that are very kind of like just hard fact. So the boundaries, political boundaries, hard fact. We cannot, interpret them. When I say sectarianism was codified, maybe sectarianism existed, but in terms of having a promise to actually help establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, that is a document in 1917. A Lebanese, French-sponsored constitution that would actually codify religious identity as actually a political element. So politicizing religion, that's kind of like turned into a legally binding document. Dividing Syria into sectarian republics, an Alawite republic, Lebanon, which was supposed to be a Christian country, a Druze republic, and so on. This is, again, sort of like imposed. And all of this is World War I. So it's kind of like, it's an easy thing to deal with when we say turning point or watershed moment, as you said. So it's almost our job as historians is kind of like almost done for us. But on the other hand, when we got to certain really questions of what story to tell and who's telling the story, from my work on Lebanon specifically, and I can generalize from that, what happens in these halls doesn't often leave. So we publish it if we're lucky. Thank you. But in terms of academic and scholarly work, that's one area. And then you have the normal, the powerful politicians who pick and choose and dictate what identity they're sponsoring or championing or just using. And in that case, the popular historian who's, again, not necessarily a trained, and actually more often than not a trained historian, they're far more powerful in that realm. And that actually leads into what history is taught in a public school system. What narrative the state wants to actually, sponsor, adopt. So our discussions barely touch that area. Those are political decisions, and they're made by politicians, not historians. And again, for those who didn't experience the events or didn't have even a second person, interaction with them, the written word in a history book you're forced to read in a classroom and to regurgitate, that becomes identity. And unfortunately, we do our best, but really we have no power to change that, not from this position at least. So, Pascal, you had a question. I noticed you had.
Thank you for these wonderful talks. I was wondering, Professor Fawaz, I know that you're very focused in your research. This is one of the things I love about it, on the interactions between vast political events like the war and the social dynamics, groups, individuals, and how these processes affect each other, maybe at the macro and the micro levels, I guess we could say. So I would love it if you could speak to that a little bit. And I'm thinking in particular because some of the students here are taking a class with me on family history. So I was wondering if in the aftermath of the war, we see social changes, for instance, at this kind of the level of these groups, the family, the neighborhood. How are these things transformed in an enduring way? Thank you.
Really, really, of course, to me, very interesting. And I think it's not been studied enough because the focus used to be on diplomatic history, and then it became on sort of political, the diplomats. In fact, there is a famous man who said history is what one diplomat says to another. Today we would reject that, but it was said, a very important saying. Today, then they went into intellectual history, which is still popular. But then finally they got into social history, which is very, very important and very lively. It is what you're talking about. Out all the tensions that we don't talk about. So I think, first of all, it happens that the topic of family history is essential to understand what's being said. My regret, perhaps, is that we don't. When I was doing my first thesis, which became my first book, I would go and visit people in Lebanon, municipalities, church, and in the. We have no archives, it said. They all said we have no archives. We all threw them out. But it was not true. Now there are young scholars in Canada and elsewhere and Germany doing excellent work on these things that they told me the archives were lost. So first, the ignorance about what actually each country has in terms of family history. The British know that, but a lot of us don't know that. And that would be a great place to get your students interested if they wanted to. Also, the connection between the vast and the small continue to be significant because they continue to kill each other. We have so many wars in the Middle East. I wish we could move away from war, not on the military front, but simply on the effect on women. And there are excellent books being written now. For example, in the case of Lebanon, scholar now at Georgetown, Elizabeth Thompson, wrote so many wonderful things about what happened to women when husbands, fathers, whatever. Because I had her book in mind, but all the things that are not studied enough about how then they themselves have to live and endure even rape, whatever that they lived with and nobody talked about in the past.
There's one point that I actually want to bring up, and that has to do with more of the colonial powers and what they did. In the case of Lebanon and Syria, it's France, and there's excellent work done on this in Jordan by Joseph Mas'ad and what the British did there. So in terms of today, anyone talking about rural Lebanon, especially the Northeast where I'm from, will always mention clans and the clan system and those large families and so on. And actually of course, there are local reasons why the extended family structure is so large in a peripheral, rural, somewhat lawless area. But also, unlike what happens often in Egypt, the last name doesn't easily drop in Lebanon. So Al-Hujayri is the last name of about 30,000 people. I always call them cousin because I don't know who's who in my hometown. So the point is, what's called even Al-Ashair, the clans in near Baalbek, definitely they were there. But the way they are now is a byproduct of the French legal system, and the way they imposed it on Lebanon. That's number one. But also, when I say sectarianism and so on, personal status laws and courts in Lebanon, again, while of course we have the Ottoman experience, the latest incarnation is a French influenced one in المحكمة الجعفرية and المحاكم. So religious courts for personal status laws. That sphere belongs to the religious authorities in Lebanon. So again, this is so many things that are sometimes even considered traditional are actually tactical decisions made by the colonial powers. So who do we deal with in this area? Yeah, this person. Now he's called Sheikh. Okay, I actually come from a family Hujayri, subsection Muhammad al-Sheikh. So again, those are all not things going back to medieval, what have you. Those are things that, a bunch of French people with guns were like, okay, who do we work with here? And they literally wrote down the law. Other questions?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Leila, for these talks. It was really insightful, and we are really grateful. Regarding the ongoing war in the Ukraine, and also I recently heard that the president of the Ukraine request from the UK and from the NATO jet in order to assist the nation to fight against the Russia. So what I'm trying to know is that isn't if the NATO or the Western countries pressure or take Russia to the end, isn't this it is the sign of the third world war? You understand me? I mean that the Western countries they are supporting the Ukraine for tanks and also soldiers. So and also Russia, it is I think the second powerful country in the world. So if this pressure keep continue, so isn't this is the alert of the Third World War? This is my question.
Again, it's a wonderful group of people because it's a very important question and very difficult question because historians, as the gentleman before you was asking me also, you try to stay in the middle, but sometimes it's very hard to stay in the middle. It looks like Ukraine is surrounded by friends and has all these powerful nation to help them. But then you have Russia, who has been, to some of us, outrageous about the way they have made people go to suffering, and the kids and the dying. So looking a war on television and around you is really very painful because it makes you realize how many things you have lived without knowing through the past. But I don't know much more on that because I don't know enough whether the children will ever remember all that, whether they'll be allowed to remember it, and whether the enemies of today will become the friends of tomorrow. So I'm not answering you directly because I don't have the answer, but it's a very good question. Do you-
Well, just a word of warning about historians and predictions. I first want to thank our audience today. I know this is a hectic time of the year, and this was an exceptional year, so thank you all for being here. This was an amazing audience. I was once asked to make a prediction the first time I gave a talk about the Syrian civil war. And I was a postdoc and I was excited. And I had so many of the facts and things were so clear. And at the same place, Marist College, actually, in the Hudson Valley, I was asked a year later to give the same talk. And I was asked the same question to make predictions. And I smiled. And then, of course, the person who had invited me smiled even further because he remembered what I'd said a year earlier, which turned out to be completely and utterly inaccurate. So I would definitely stay away from predictions as a historian. Personally, I never get it right. So I'm sorry about that. Other questions?
I also wanted to mention that I have not, I get very flustered. It's a new time here, first time here, and I was so excited about this trip. You ask my poor husband, even today is his birthday and he's spending it here because it was so important to me and then to him to take part and get to know you and to be here. But one thing I have missed is I haven't thanked enough people, those who came to the hotel, those who helped us get here. And I also want to thank Naila. I was just checking the last name because I've never met you before. But it was very kind of you to give this generous introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Join me once more in thanking Leila for her talk and